Washington, and he's director for the Center for Leadership and Media Studies. And he was a professor of communications from 2008 to 2011 at George Washington University, following a dozen years on the faculty at Mary Washington. He's the author of 4 books on media and politics. He worked for 10 years as a daily newspaper journalist before becoming an academic, and mostly with the Kansas City Star and Times. He's lectured on the news media and elections and held reporter training seminars in India, the Philippines, Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Lithuania, Armenia, which is a personal interest of mine, being of Armenian background, and Estonia, on the programs funded by the U.S. Government. And he was a Canada-U.S. Fulbright Research Scholar at McGill University in Montreal during 2006 and 2007. He's received his PhD and his MA in government from Georgetown University and a BA in history at the University of Missouri in government from, and a BA in government from Dartmouth College. And he also was a moderator for Congressman Wolf's debate, the candidates forum. That was a couple of years ago. If you go to our website, you get to see that. In fact, I did that and just watched how he conducted that, and it was quite nice to see. And so I would like to yield the floor to Dr. Farnsworth so we can begin the proceedings. So keep it close like that. Okay.
Thank you very much. I would ask the candidates to take the stage, and a round of applause would be appropriate. Congressman Wittman will be here in a moment. Okay. Oh, he's in the building. Okay, excellent. And Gail Parker? Okay. While we're waiting for the congressman, it would probably be useful for me to just go through some of the ground rules so that everyone understands how this is worked. This information has already been mailed to the candidates, so they know how this will operate. We will have a series of questions that have come from your committee. A total of 6 probably is how many we'll get to in the time that we have. We will each person will take turns speaking with the question. Each candidate has 2 minutes to make an initial statement on the question, and then there is a minute each for rebuttal. And then we're going to move through the questions, and each person has the opportunity to be first, and so on as we go through the process. There is an opportunity for the candidates to ask questions of each other, and so that in that case you have a 2-minute opportunity to respond to that, and then you have the opportunity to do a question of each candidate on the stage. Congressman Wittman, please come on down. Yes, I know Congress was working today.
How you doing?
Wonderful. So we're just going through the ground rules now. The timer, if you would identify yourself. Now you have cards that you're going to show, right? So that you can see what you'll be looking at. So you have a time is up card. You have a card for half gone.
20 seconds. 1 minute.
Okay. So if everyone is ready, we will. If Gail Parker shows up, we'll include her as when she arrives. But we will, the agreement was that we would go in alphabetical order with the initial round of questions. It's 2 minutes for the statement and then a minute for response after both people have spoken 2 minutes. The first question, of course, the central question that we can look at is Syria. What is the American role in Syria? What policies should the United States pursue to deal with the threat of ISIS specifically and radical extremists in general? What should be the United States and or the international community's role to prevent genocide of racial and or minority groups in Syria and Iraq? First, Mr. Mosher for 2 minutes, and then Mr. Wittman for 2 minutes.
Keep one mic.
We're not having opening statements.
I didn't see a list on the material that you received for open statements.
Yes, we're each allowed 3 minutes for an opening statement, I believe.
Okay.
All right?
Okay, I'm sorry. We'll do it that way.
Okay.
See, I got this introduction about how good I was last year at this, and so now the first thing happens. So we'll go. You'll go first with the
Right.
3 minutes, and Mr. Wittman, you go first with a question for 2 minutes. But you'll also have an opening statement.
Thank you to the PWC100 for sponsoring this political debate. Political debates are important for democracy, and this is my very first. I'm not a career politician. I'll not fool you with bombast or diversion or feed you word salad. I am not someone who can say tonight, I just talked with the speaker and urged him to do the right thing, or just talked to Chairman X and urged him to find balance in whatever he's doing. What you will hear from me are sincere statements of policy and beliefs formed by study and service to our country. I will not rave, rage, or try to fire you up. That's not me. I learned long ago that when a captain of a ship starts raving, bad things are happening. In my 26 years in the Navy, my core values of leadership, integrity, and accountability were forged. My years serving as professional staff on the Senate Armed Services Committee, when we had giants of our legislative process like Chairman Sam Nunn, Senator John Warner, and Senator Ted Kennedy, allowed me a glimpse at good governance, and I had a chance to participate in it. But now I look at Congress that is dysfunctional, spawned in large measure by extremists on the right and the members they control. When this debate is through, I trust you will agree that service in the Congress of our United States is an honor and a privilege and a duty. And it's not just for someone who believes that it's the best job they ever had. When I was wondering whether I would accept this challenge to run for Congress or not, I took a little bit of time to look at first principles. Richard Henry Lee of Virginia asked John Adams of Massachusetts before the Declaration of Independence to give some thoughts to the other founders regarding government. So he did. He wrote a little pamphlet called Thoughts on Government. And in it he gave this remark. He said, the divine science of politics is the science of social happiness. And he considered that the core principle that our government should organize itself around. And you'll recognize that a few months later, the notion of happiness came into the Declaration of Independence, and it was one of the principles, along with life and liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And in just a few lines later in the Declaration of Independence, it was said, the government that has been formed is not adequate to meet these ends, then a new government must be formed to encourage the safety and happiness of all. And in closing, I would ask you, Are you happy with this Congress? Or is it time to change? Thank you.
Well, good evening. It truly is an honor and a privilege to be here with you. I'd like to thank the Prince William County 100 for putting on this debate. I'd like to thank Norm also for joining us this evening. This is what makes our country great, our democracy great, is the ability for our candidates to get up and share ideas, give their vision about what needs to happen in this country, the challenges that we have. And there are many challenges, folks. And one thing is for certain, as we see what's happening in Washington, Washington, by any measure, is broken. We see the things that need to be done. Those things aren't being done. Something as simple as passing a budget. Something as simple as getting appropriations bills done. Getting the tough decisions for this nation taken care of. That's what all of us are charged with. And I'm blessed. I get to travel home each evening, back to my wife, and understand that there's a real world out there. There is a world outside that 90 square miles of fantasy land we call Washington. And getting connected back to that each evening, to me, really gets me focused on the things that need to be done. I grew up in the area, so I go past people's homes that I've known all my life. And I can ask myself a question. Could I knock on their door today and tell them what I did in Washington, and would they say, Rob, good job? And I think that's a pretty simple metric, a pretty simple connection with folks back home that for many in Washington is missing. That's what I believe we need. I'm blessed, too, that get to go home each evening to my lovely wife, who is a school teacher. She has taught school for 35 years, and she gives me her perspective on things. Both of my children live close by. I get to see my grandchildren. I look into their eyes each day, and I say, what are we doing to make sure that life is better for my children and for their children? I think that's an obligation for all of us there in Congress to never forget. I want to make sure we're working on making things better, making sure that this nation has what it needs, not just today, but also into the future. And I work every day to do that. And how I do that is to make sure that I listen to folks back home. I spend a tremendous amount of time when I'm not in Washington. I'm traveling back in the district. I just retired a 2005 Toyota Corolla that had 410,000 miles on it. So I travel to stay in touch with folks, take that real world perspective, and take that back to Washington to put together a good policy, to put together good common sense ideas, and working across the aisle to get things done. I think that's what we need to be doing. You know, there is no ownership on good ideas from one side or the other. And I think we ought to be focusing on those things that we agree upon, both sides, and get those things done. That's what makes our nation great. That's what will continue to make us great. And that's what I've continued to do in working with others like Senator Warner, Senator Kane, Mr. Connolly, Mr. Scott, Mr. Moran. So I want to make sure we continue to do that, and that's my focus, to be able to get that done. So folks, thanks again, and it's a great opportunity to be here with you tonight.
Just a housekeeping matter. We ask that now that you've been able to applaud the opening statements, that there be no further applause with response to each question. It maximizes our opportunity to hear from our candidates tonight, and we'll have an opportunity to recognize their opportunity for us to thank them at the end of the event altogether. So the first question then goes. The first question goes to Mr. Wittman, and it is the question of what should be done with respect to the situation in Syria.
Yes.
It's 2 minutes for each of the candidates on the first round, and then there's the opportunity for 1 minute rebuttal.
Sure.
Subsequently on that question, then we move on to the next one. To repeat the question, what policies should the U.S. pursue to deal with the threat of ISIS specifically and radical Islamic extremists in general? What should be the United States or the international community's role to prevent genocide of racial and minority groups in Syria and Iraq?
First, ISIS must be destroyed. There is no negotiating, no persuading ISIS. They are treacherous, they are barbaric, it's unequivocal. The world sees that, the United States sees that. That needs to be our purpose. But we do need to engage other nations to do that. So I do believe that we need to be engaging moderate forces as we can identify them in Syria to begin that particular effort. Extremism around the world, I believe, is an obligation for all nations, Islamic nations as well as non-Islamic nations, to stand against that form of treachery and make sure that we wipe it out. That I think is absolutely the key. Nations need to be working together to get that done. I think there's a focus across the world today on that. We saw the news in the headlines this morning. In Australia, we see ISIS threatening to behead people on the street. That kind of barbarism, that kind of treachery is by any means unacceptable. And we need to make sure that we understand the effort that it's going to take from other countries, including our country, to get that done. It can't solely be a United States effort. But the United States, I do believe, is in the position to lead on this effort, to gather other nations, both Islamic and non-Islamic nations, to say that we will stand against this, because if we don't, this will continue to get worse. We will see not only persecution, but deaths and, unfortunately, humanitarian crises around the world as these extremist organizations continue to push their efforts in this violence. We have to, as a world, stand against this. If we do not, the world we live in will be a much more dangerous place. And remember, the focus of these groups is to wipe out anybody that doesn't believe in their very narrow version of the Quran. And I can tell you there are other folks in the Islamic communities that don't believe that. So we all need to stand together to make sure that we wipe out this treachery. Thank you.
Solving the problems of the Middle East in 2 minutes. A difficult chore. ISIS is a violent and despicable organization. But we have to recognize that we have to take some responsibility for the existence of ISIS. When we invaded Iraq, we upset the balance, and it let loose forces that we can't control. It is absolutely right that we should put together an international coalition to try and take care of this insult to the rest of the world. And frankly, the nations that are under the most threat should be taking the lead. I would like to see a stronger role by Saudi Arabia and Qatar. I think it's terribly important that we continue our negotiations with Iran so that they are doing what they should be doing in the region and not developing nuclear weapons. Our relationship with Turkey should be stronger so that that border is closed and ISIS gets contained. And of course, although it's very difficult at the moment, our relationship with Egypt is one that needs to be nurtured. To some degree, what is going on in Syria and Iraq is just an extension of 1,400 years of religious warfare. And we have to understand that we can't put boots on the ground in that region without being considered an occupier. If there's anything that will make those people unite, is the notion that they are being occupied by a Western nation. We should provide all the air power that we can to help in this effort. I don't like to see advisors going in. I was an advisor for a year in Vietnam to a paramilitary outfit before American combat troops come in, and I know how difficult that is. I think arm's length, form the coalition, provide all the support that we can, lead it, but don't get boots on the ground, and by all means, the president has to come to Congress to get permission for anything further.
I do believe that the president does need authorization of the use of military force for anything more than what's been given to him through December. As you know, the bill that passed yesterday was just permission for him to arm and equip vetted Syrian moderate opposition groups there. So I do believe that there needs to be an authorization of use of military force. I do believe that we have NATO allies such as Turkey that know Syria very well. In fact, I had the opportunity to travel visited with the Syrian opposition leaders in the Turkish refugee camps where those Syrian leaders cross the border each evening to come over and get away from Bashar al-Assad and his efforts to wipe out any kind of opposition. I also went to Syria, just briefly, to talk to forces there about the challenges that they are facing. We have to engage our best NATO ally, which is Turkey. They understand the area. Want to make sure, too, that we engage other nations around the region. Jordan, King Abdullah there, I've had conversations with him about the things that we need to do. We want to make sure, too, that we are engaging other Sunni nations there, like Saudi Arabia, where we know funding is coming to these extremist groups. So I want to make sure that those things are being done. We have to do that across the board. We have to do that not only with NATO, but also with those Islamic nations that will work with us. And understand, too, that there are many disparate groups in Syria. If we are going to go in, which we should, and wipe out ISIS, we need to understand that there are other extremist groups there. So when we do that, we have to be very careful about what the future ramifications of that effort will be and identify other extremist groups there as we are there along with our partners and make sure that we eradicate that in the long run. I don't want us to continue to have to go back into these areas. We go after one extremist group and then another one pops up. And I can tell you, having traveled to Africa and visited with our regionally aligned force and seen the extremist groups there, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, that extremism is in many places around the world. We have to work cooperatively with other nations, not just in the Middle East, but elsewhere, because that extremism does migrate, and it migrates to areas where they believe there's an opportunity. We have to stop those opportunities, united as a world to do that.
A little bit of caution is urged here. While there's a difficult diplomatic dance we have to do with Turkey because Turkey is a NATO partner. An attack on Turkey commits all of NATO and commits us. So the finest kind of diplomacy has got to be conducted here to ensure that Turkey is not attacked, or we're in it, and it won't be good.
Mr. Mosher is first to answer the next question. In 1986, immigration reform was enacted with bipartisan support. This granted amnesty to an estimated 3 million illegal aliens. 1986 reform also instituted tough enforcement provisions to discourage the flow of new illegal aliens. Most observers agree that there are now more than 10 million illegal aliens currently in the United States, and that our southern border remains somewhat easy to cross. The question is, what specific forms of immigration reform would you support? 2 minutes.
First of all, I would take up the bill on the House floor that the Senate, in a bipartisan way, sent over to the House. We can't solve this problem unless we talk about it. And letting that bill just sit there, and the extremists in the Republican Party keeping the Speaker from taking up the bill, is an insult to all of us who want to see this problem ended. Now, there aren't enough buses in the world, I think, to deport what may be 12 to 13 million undocumented persons in this country. However, they are here, they're contributing to our culture, and they have to have a path to citizenship. The current bill has a path that's difficult, it's rocky. It weeds out those who are criminals, and it's entirely reasonable to impose that kind of a requirement on folks for citizenship. On our southern border, there is no wall that I know of that's been put up in the world that has kept people from crossing it or going under it or going around it. It's false security to think that you can build a wall that will solve the problem. Better to concentrate on a wall on the south of Mexico. Better to concentrate on careful diplomacy and aid to the countries south of Mexico that are sending so many children that we have to deal with. And those children are a humanitarian problem first. And they are covered by a law from the Bush era that we should observe and give them full due process of a law. It would be inhuman to send those children back to certain death. We can't do that as a nation, and we have to accept that we have a humanitarian duty first.
I think the solution is very simple. We have to reinstill in the minds of Americans trust in the system of immigration that we have right now. There is not trust in that system. I think reestablishing that trust has to start with securing the border. It's not all about physical barriers. There's all kinds of technology out there that we can put in place that will secure the borders and ensure, not only from an immigration standpoint, from a national security standpoint, that the border is secure. There's a twofold purpose behind doing that. I think people need to be confident that the border is secure. We also have to fix our visa programs. As you know, anybody that's traveled, when you go to another country and get a visa, it's a very specific time frame that you're allowed to be there. You have to identify where you are located, and if you overstay that visa, folks in that country are going to come and find you. We need to have the same integrity in our visa program here, whether it's for work visas, student visas, visitation visas. 40% of folks that are here illegally are here on overstayed visas. That's a simple solution that we can combine with securing the border and reinstill in the American public's mind trust in that system. At that point, when we have a metric, a measure that says that we are successful in doing that, and remember, there will be some leakage across the border, but certainly not what we have today, I believe then you can begin to have the discussion about how to address the folks that are here currently illegally. But if you don't do that, then we'll repeat the mistakes of the past where we have gotten things backwards, and that is we talk about how to address folks that are here, but we don't do the necessary hard work to make sure borders are secure and that our visa programs work. That's fundamental to what America's about. As I talk to folks that have come here through the legal processes in place today, they are the most adamant about saying, make sure that you properly enforce the laws that we have on the books. That, I think, is where we need to start to reestablish that trust in our system.
I spent half my life listening to people who put their faith in technology, and it doesn't work. I remember when McNamara was going to just carpet the whole border between Laos and Vietnam with technology, so we would know when the VC were on the move, or the North Vietnamese, and we would bomb them. Didn't work, lost that war. Fences don't work.
What we need is to make sure that we are taking action. Whether it's a fence, whether it's technology. If technology doesn't work and you don't want a fence, then what do we do? There has to be a solution. We have to address this. We can't just say, well, we're not going to address the issue on the border. Whether it's a physical barrier, whether it is technology, we must secure the border. We must fix the visa programs. Those are simple solutions that I think people across the board agree upon. Let's work on those things that everyone agrees upon. That's what's wrong with Washington right now. It's too much absolutism. It's all, well, we're not going to do this or we can't do that. Let's look at the realm of possibility. Let's take those areas that we agree upon, get those things done.
Next question is for you, Mr. Wittman. Inversion has gotten a lot of attention in recent days. Inversion is the process of moving corporate headquarters away from the United States to avoid our federal tax rate. The U.S. has relatively high corporate taxes, as you know. Is there some form of corporate tax reform needed? If no, why not? And if yes, what policies would you support?
An answer, yes, we do need reform to our corporate tax code. It's pretty simple. I had a chance before Steve Jobs passed away to go visit Apple Computer, the most successful company in the world. I asked him two questions. I said, Steve, could you and Steve Wozniak today go to your garage and start Apple Computers? His answer was pretty simple. No, he couldn't. He believed that two things, the amount of regulation he would have to deal with and access to capital would prevent him from doing that. I asked the second question. I said, what then today is the biggest challenge for Apple Computers? He said pure and simply this. He said it was the tax system. and having to pay a tax to send Apple dollars back into the United States. He said that tax was the most harmful for Apple Computer, and it forced them to send jobs overseas. He was pretty straightforward about it. That, I believe, is one area that we can fix in the tax code. Today, when we have a U.S. company that has a subsidiary overseas, and remember, that's how businesses operate today. They do have international business. We want to make sure that they're not penalized for bringing those dollars back in the United States. Today, the corporate tax rate in Ireland is 14%. The corporate tax rate here in the United States is 38%. Apple Computer, to bring money back in, has to pay that difference. So what do? They keep the dollars overseas. They don't bring that money back in. They have to borrow money here if they're going to grow Apple USA. Let's fix our corporate tax system. Let's bring down the corporate tax rate to where it's level with the average across the world. Take away the exemptions and the loopholes, but only do that if you're going to lower the corporate tax rate. That has to be what we do, I believe, to level the playing field. We have to look at our tax code and make sure that we are competitive and not penalize companies for sending jobs overseas. To me, that is critical, and the easiest way is I talk to businesses around the district, not just in Prince William County, but around the district, and saying, Rob, fix the tax code. Make it fair and equitable for all companies, including American companies.
Recently, Senator Levin's subcommittee on investigations reported that there were 30 American multinationals that during a 3-year period paid no taxes whatsoever. Our statutory rate may be 38%, but the effective rate that is actually being paid is more on the order of 12 to 15%, just like Ireland. There are many reasons, but companies send their business overseas. There's transfer pricing of taking advantage of the lowest tax rate for what you think is the most important part of your business. And in case of Nike, it's the logo. There is so much money awash in tax havens overseas that one economist has calculated that if it were brought home and taxed at nominal rates, half of our public debt would disappear. Companies are going abroad not to escape the tax rate, which really effectively is 12 to 15%. They're going abroad for other reasons. And it was admitted by Burger King when they decided to go to Canada that it was not for tax reasons. So yes, we need to fix our tax code. We need to close all the loopholes. We need to stop subsidies to advanced industries. We need to protect our infant industries. But you can't change the tax code until all the loopholes are stopped, so that we know actually what we're getting for national revenue. We have a system where we have a low-wage economy, where people are not paying income taxes. In fact, they're getting earned income tax credits. We have corporations, financial institutions, and ultra wealthy people who are paying rates at 15% and stashing money in tax havens. I finish the sentence. Leaving to a shrinking middle class the burden of supporting this country.
We may be able to point to a number of large companies that have a zero tax payment that they make to the federal government, but I would argue this: the vast majority of companies don't. As I talk to small businesses, they say, fix the corporate tax code. They pay an extraordinary amount, especially if you're a small business trying to get underway. This current corporate tax code is burdensome, and I'm hearing that directly from businesses. So we can point to those 30, but if we really want to be able to fix this, we bring that average corporate tax rate down to make sure that we level the playing field so that our small businesses operate on the same plane as our larger businesses. That's the reasonable and thoughtful way to go about this. That's what tax reform ought to be about, making sure that we are encouraging all businesses I want to make sure that we bring that tax rate down. If we just go in and say we get rid of loopholes and exemptions, but you keep the tax rate there, it ends up increasing taxes and creating even more of a burden on companies. Let's make sure that we make them competitive in what they can do to realize their potential here in the United States.
When Mr. Romney was running for president and he finally released 2 years of his tax returns, and we found that he was being taxed at a 12% rate, and a lot of his money, including his 401k that his children would inherit, was in Bermuda, nobody was shocked. It used to be in this country that a tax cheat or a tax avoider was looked on like a cockroach. Now it's looked on as, gee, he's a really smart guy. And that bothers me a lot.
The next question first to Mr. Mosher for 2 minutes. It concerns the minimum wage. What is the appropriate federal policy concerning the minimum wage? Should it be raised? Should it be eliminated? And discuss the impact on the economy of the policy that you support with respect to the minimum wage.
The minimum wage should certainly be raised. The thought that we have companies that are that are making their business plans based on pegging the hours and the wages of their employees on the assumption that they will go on public assistance is just shameful. If we raise the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour, which it is currently proposed, and in some places in the country, local facilities are actually raising it to $15 an hour, I believe that we can get those people off public assistance, and maybe Mr. Wittman would not cut the SNAP program as he has in the past. We need to think not just of a minimum wage, in my view, but a livable wage. What does it take to keep people off public assistance, keep pride in their work, and be able to be fully functioning members of society? In our low-wage economy, people are working 2 and 3 jobs and delivering pizza at night to try to keep their head above water. Their children are not being watched over carefully as they should. We're imposing a terrible burden on too large a segment of the society that we call the working poor.
The Congressional Budget Office, in their evaluation of the impact of a rise in the minimum wage, is purely this: 1 million jobs lost. Today, why would we want to be taking jobs away? Let's make sure that people have the opportunity to work. The issue should be, where are the jobs to move into from minimum wage? I don't want anybody staying at minimum wage. Only 3% of head of households make minimum wage. Let's talk about the real issue. The real issue is the jobs that people need to move into from minimum wage. I want them to be able to start work, to develop a good, sound career path, and to be able to have that middle-class job. If we look at it today, we ought to make sure that our education system is directed to making sure that people are educated for the workforce. I've done a number of workshops, one right here in Prince William County, on workforce development. If we want to solve this issue, let's focus on the real problem. Let's focus on developing our workforce for the jobs of the future. If you look at it today, not everybody is going to get the job that they need by going to college. Let's start to have the emphasis on saying, listen, you can do a fantastic job over a career in a non-college degree area. We have lots of great examples of that. Our career and technical education fields. Here in the 1st Congressional District, HII, Huntington Ingalls Industries, the shipyard there are 23,000 shipbuilders there, build the best ships in the world, highly skilled craftsmen. They make more over a lifetime than a college graduate. Let's start to emphasize career and technical education programs. Let's make sure that students get to a place where they can get a good job that pays more than the minimum wage, that they can have over a career where we reestablish the middle class. The focus then should be workforce development, making sure that our children get the proper education to get to a job where they can be successful over a career. That's the true issue, and just ask Governor McCall if that's his focus in his administration.
I've listened too long to Speaker Boehner saying, where are the jobs? The jobs are in legislation that Republicans refuse to allow to go forward. The American Jobs Act was filibustered in the Senate. The Infrastructure Development Bank Act, sponsored by Rosa DeLauro in the House, co-sponsored by all Democrats, dies in committee. And there are other examples that I will give later. But in fact, we have a party that thinks that if the economy is stagnant, that the president will be blamed for that. And so they're willing, for political purposes, to keep slowing the economy down and not putting in the kinds of inputs that would stimulate and grow our economy and lower our national debt in relation to the growth of the economy.
Folks, the numbers are pretty simple. There are 40 House bills that are sitting on the Senate desk involving direct efforts to create and grow jobs in the United States. The numbers are simple, and let me tell you, the Speaker every day talks about, let's at least have a discussion on the Senate side of those bills. That, I think, is where the discussion needs to be. There has to be the ability on both sides to bring this up. The idea of somehow saying it's one side's fault is what's wrong with Washington. Let's get to the point to say, let's have the debate about these bills. Somehow saying that certain bills that are there in the House is one thing, but making sure that we have the full discussion of those bills on the Senate side is what needs to happen. That's where the problems are there in Washington. 40 bills sitting in the Senate box waiting to be debated. Let's have the debate. If the Senate's got a better version, let's go ahead and have that debate. Let's send that over to the House. Let's get those bills to conference. The Speaker every day talks about those 40 job bills and saying, let's get them to the floor for the debate.
This question concerns the question of redefining marriage. A few years ago, opponents of a proposed marriage amendment to the federal Constitution cited the inherent authority of states to define marriage within their borders as the reason why a federal constitutional amendment was unnecessary. Recently, federal courts, including the Eastern District of Virginia and the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, have struck down such law and state constitutional provisions. The question is this: should Congress take action? Should it leave the dispute to the courts? If the Congress should take action, what should that action be? Should Congress in some way take steps to define marriage for the country?
Well, first of all, there is a duly adopted bill that passed Congress. That is the law of the land, and we see it in states too. In Virginia, there's a constitutional amendment. States should have that determination, and I believe that the determination should be made through state legislatures, and that the will of the people is reflected through those state legislatures. We see that in Virginia now. We see the back and forth between the Attorney General. In fact, today in the General Assembly, the debate was, what should the General Assembly do in addressing the issue of a duly adopted constitutional amendment defining marriage in Virginia? It should be reflective of the folks in Virginia through their elected body. I think that's the way things should happen. That's the way it is here in Virginia. Obviously, the legislature will have a debate, and they have had today, about how that law is defended, how it should be projected in the court, and in what ways should the state's lawyer do that, or should somebody else do that. I think that's the debate that takes place there at the state level, and that's where I believe the issue is best determined. And again, I believe that folks are elected in the legislature to do that. When we see the courts getting involved, in this instance where they're superseding what has been clearly demonstrated as the will of the people through the legislature, that to me is what needs to be reflected in the law of the land. And I think it's pretty simple and straightforward. And if there's a difference of opinion, then folks have the opportunity to go to the polls and express that difference of opinion. in who they see and what their elected officials do. Thank you.
I must say, I've never understood really all the emotion about this. When you desire to get married, you have to get a license and form a contract, essentially. When you want to get unmarried, you have to have a property settlement before the marriage can be undone. I don't see any reason why anyone can't marry anyone else on the same basis that my wife and I are married. We've made a contract, and if we want to end that contract, we have to get a property settlement before it can be undone. Should states be involved in it? I think they will, whether they should or not. But I really do believe equal is equal, and that's the end of it.
The states do need to be involved when anybody goes to get a marriage license. It says on their state of Virginia. That's what I believe needs to happen. The state needs to be involved. The elected body, those most answerable to the people, need to be the determiner of what the definition of marriage is in each state. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Our founding fathers even designed government to make sure that that happened, to where the elected bodies represent the will of the people. And since in Virginia and every other state, this license is issued by the state should be the determiner of what that license means and the conditions under which that license is issued.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question. This concerns the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. Healthcare reform remains controversial. There are reports that some Virginians have lost their health care coverage due to implementation of the Affordable Care Act, and others have experienced increases in their health care costs. The question is this: what action would you take regarding the Affordable Care Act? If you wish to repeal it, what would you replace it with? If you oppose repeal, what would you advocate, if anything, for changing it in the years ahead?
The Affordable Care Act has been the subject for doomsayers for several years now. The fact of the matter is the act has failed to fail. The start of it was rocky, yes, but I've also been involved with weapon systems that have the same startup problems. It's a lot of software, it's a lot of integration, and it seldom starts smoothly. But it did finally get smoothed out. The numbers that signed up met the goal for the first year. The demographics were suitable. We had enough young people to balance things out. And portions of the Affordable Care Act that went into effect with no fanfare whatsoever is really working. In Medicare, the Affordable Care Act put in a fraud detection and punishment panel, if you will. It has already saved us $19 billion. And I don't know what is the problem with the Affordable Care Act. What's wrong with keeping your kids on your policy until they're 26? What's wrong with having no pre-existing conditions? What's wrong with limiting the overhead of insurance companies? What's wrong with stopping insurance companies from dropping you when you're sick? All of these things are a thing of the past. The markets in the state worked where states implemented them, and worked when the feds had to step in and create the markets. More companies want to come into the markets in the next enrollment period, which starts in November. Undoubtedly, it's a big program, and it will be tweaked at the edges and made to work better, but it has taken a very long time for us to have a universal health insurance program, and we're on the road.
I think if you ask the 250,000 Virginians that are getting ready to lose their coverage, they probably wouldn't share the same ideal that it's failed to fail. The bottom line is this: I want to make sure that we have a system that works that fulfills the two promises that were made, and that is it reduces cost and it increases choice. And as I've traveled across this district, I've talked to folks, and I haven't come across anybody that has said it's fulfilled those two promises. I've gone and met with our hospitals across this district. Each and every one of them have talked about the significant problems that they are having with the Affordable Care Act. Now, there are elements of it that we should keep. We should keep the provision where people cannot be denied coverage based on pre-existing condition, and that children up to age 26 can stay on their policies. Let's transition, keep those two elements. Let's get rid of the rest of it. I know that we can do better. Let's replace it with, I believe, fundamental reforms that are simple and straightforward, making sure that instead of having state exchanges that limit opportunities for folks, such as the state of New Hampshire, where only 16 of the 28 hospitals are actually included in the plan, where people there don't have the choice that they need to get the health care under purchasing the exchanges. Let's make sure that we fix those things. Let's extend the markets across the United States. There's no reason that we can't do that to where insurance can be marketed across state lines. Let's do some simple tort reform where states that have had tort reform that has worked, like the state of Virginia, let's copy that model, put it across the nation to be able to reduce costs for our physicians. As I talk to our hospitals too, they want to make sure that it's a system that's simpler, that helps them in providing care to patients. The bottom line is this: let's put the power back in the hands of the patient and the provider, not in the hands of the payer. That's what we have right now, is a payer-centered system. If we put the determinations back in the hands of the patient and provider, that's how we can really reform the system. The way you do that is to make sure that people have the choice, and the choice to be able to fashion their coverage to meet their family budget needs. They do not have that now.
If there's a problem in Virginia, it's the fact that 400,000 Virginians are being denied care under the Medicaid expansion portion of the Affordable Care Act. And that's being driven by politics in Richmond. Our health care costs have been twice as high as any other industrial nation's health care system, and our outcomes have not been as good as measured in live births and life expectancy. We finally got a system where we can start bearing down on those costs while ensuring expansion of those who are covered and lowering costs. The fact is that the Affordable Care Act is responsible for a reduction of 15% costs already, and it can be expected to go down in the future. We're lagging other countries in measurable ways, and we're paying more for it, and this puts us on the road to getting better, and it's going to be a hard slog ahead, bit by bit.
If you take the measure of the premiums that people pay after they go into the exchanges, by any measure we see those premiums increasing from 3% upwards to 17%. So premiums for people are increasing. That is not saving people money. In addition, the choice is not there. People are saying, listen, I had a plan that worked for me. It worked for my family budget. Now I'm forced into buying a plan that the government tells me I have to have. I hear from people every day to say, now the plan that I'm forced to buy is now unaffordable. And remember, it's not just the premiums. Deductibles have gone up, co-payments have gone up. For families on fixed incomes, that is tremendously harmful. Let's put the power back in the hands of the patient and the provider to determine the best course of care, to determine how they fashion their coverage, how they fashion the care they receive, so they get both. They get affordable coverage, they get the choice to make sure they can meet their health care needs. That's how the system works best, by making sure that individual decisions are made, not something done at the federal government level without any knowledge of individuals' needs.
Our next question concerns immigration funding for Prince William County. Funding of the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Program agreement previously allowed local law enforcement authorities to investigate the immigration status of arrestees. This program was discontinued in Prince William County. The question to the candidates, and Mr. Wittman goes first, would you support reinstatement of federal funding to support Prince William County's law that the immigration status of arrestees be determined?
I would support any federal effort, including funding to localities, but also to states, to make sure there's a cooperative program there to make sure immigration laws are enforced. As you know, right now, some of the challenges that state and local governments have is that when they apprehend somebody on a immigration law violation and they call the Immigration Custom Enforcement Agency, many times they're told, we don't have any place to take them. We don't have the opportunity or the ability to go ahead and take that person and make sure that the law is applied. When we have state police and local police that are able to do that, willing to do that, but lack the funds to do that, we need to be looking at those cooperative agreements to make sure that those things can happen, especially as we look across the United States and we see that the number of Immigration Custom Enforcement agents lack the demand necessary to fill what localities and states see the need. So I want to make sure that we're doing that. Any type of those cooperative agreements, we see border states struggle with that. Virginia also, you know, has offered the state police to work in conjunction with the federal government. As you know, they have to ask permission to be able to do that, to enforce the federal immigration laws. I think that both local and state law enforcement need to have the authority to do that. But they also need to have a cooperative agreement with those agencies to make sure that the funds come there for them to be able to help do that, because this does get to be a burden on localities. And I believe, too, that as we look at all elements of government, local and state level implementation of the laws and application of the laws, I think, is the best application of those laws, because who knows better than local governments and state governments about what the needs are and how to properly adjudicate these instances where you have folks that are here illegally. So I would be in full support of those cooperative agreements with both local governments and state governments.
I certainly can agree with the necessity for cooperative agreements, and where funds are required for the local enforcement of those cooperative agreements, it should be there. However, it should also be a hard requirement that profiling not take place. It's been a bad experience in many places when that has been the mode of the police to enforce immigration laws. And that's all I have to say about it.
Both candidates have passed on rebuttals. We're going to move on to the next question. This question concerns your priorities for Prince William County. What do you consider to be the most pressing issue for residents of Prince William County, Manassas, and Manassas Park? And what would you do to address this top priority if elected to Congress?
Well, as you know, the sequester is running madly across all budgets, and the governor estimates that it's going to cost Virginia, particularly Northern Virginia, something on the order of $50 billion by the time the sequester runs out in 1921. That makes it all the more urgent that we create jobs and that we get an infrastructure development bank so that we can start repairing our crumbling infrastructure, our roads, our 64,000 bridges that are deemed unsafe, tunnels, waterways, modernizing the electric grid, and yes, providing money for those projects that we know that we're going to have to undertake to meet the challenge of rising sea levels. Because, ladies and gentlemen, climate change is real. It's here, it's now. It's happening. It's happening in Norfolk. It's happening in several of our counties in the district, including Lancaster County, where I live. And those are going to be big projects, and they're going to create a lot of jobs that'll be good paying jobs, that'll be spent in the economy, that'll create the demand for goods and services that will increase the economy broaden the tax base, and we'll all be better off for an investment in America, in jobs that can't be offshored. Thank you.
I think the most important county issue that I've learned in traveling around, talking to folks in the county, meeting with the Chamber of Commerce members, talking to citizens, is transportation. Transportation is tied to the economy, the time it takes for businesses to deliver goods, the time it takes for people to get to their workplace. That affects the economy. I think things we need to do is to get the Federal Highway Transportation Act reauthorized. It was only reauthorized for a short period of time. Let's reauthorize it for a longer period of time. Let's have the debate about how do we make sure that we are properly addressing those highway needs and other transportation needs. I think all those are all part of the discussion. And you know, here in the county, there's been a lot of discussion about how do we address road needs here, how do we address rail needs. I think ultimately the decisions are made by the local government. The way it's designed is for local government, Prince William County and the state of Virginia, to make determinations about what will happen with that. There is a federal involvement as far as the gasoline tax that's collected by the federal government that needs to be returned to the state of Virginia. The state of Virginia is still a donor state. We still only receive back 98 cents on every dollar that we send to Washington. One thing we can do is to make sure that because of the demand placed on our roads from who? Washington, we ought to get at least $1 back for every dollar we send to Washington. To me, that's a pretty simple formula there. That can yield more dollars back to the state that can go to state and local governments to make sure they're meeting their transportation needs. I think that's a big issue. It is related to jobs because as I visit folks like food distributors here, U.S. Foods, and putting their trucks on the road, say, Rob, got to do something about transportation because our trucks sit on in traffic while we're waiting to deliver our food. That costs them money. Additionally, too, as I meet with the Chamber of Commerce folks, they want to make sure, too, that we are doing everything we can to help in job growth. And the single theme that I hear from them from the federal government is, Rob, please, just get the federal government out of the way. Let us do the things that we know how to do as businesses, and we can make sure we grow jobs and grow this economy.
I first came to Washington in 1966, and we've been working on 95 and all the clover leafs in the Washington area for all that time. Came up from Fredericksburg last night, which should have been an easy trip, and it was a nightmare. Senator Warner said the same thing. It took him 3.5 hours to get from Washington to Fredericksburg to open his local office there. The answer to our transportation problems is not more roads and more cars. It's public transportation. All lines lead to Washington and out to the suburbs, and we ought to be looking at mass transit to solve the congestion problems. We can't keep going as we are, and in economics there's an old saying, something that can't keep going on forever will stop.
Mass transit is part of the answer, and I've worked with the state, worked with the Federal Rail Administration to get the third leg of the Virginia Railway Express, better known as VRE, here to the region to make sure that we have that transportation corridor there. It is indeed part of the solution, but I can tell you this, ask anybody that transacts business, that delivers goods, that delivers services, and they will tell you, you have to have roadways as the major corridor to make sure that transaction of business can happen. Moving people, we can certainly have a portion of that with rail, and we've done that. But we also want to make sure that we are looking at the infrastructure on roads. Things like the Prince William Transportation Authority and bus lines are a part of the solution. But remember too, folks, we have to look at the cost per passenger mile as we are allocating funding for transportation. That makes sure that we make the best use of our dollars in moving people and goods and services around. So it has to be more than just saying mass transportation. It sounds good in principle, but when you look at the cost per passenger mile, rail is a portion of, but not the sole way to make sure that we address our transportation problems.
At this point in the program, the candidates will have an opportunity to ask a question of each other. To go through, to remind everyone of the situation here, the rules, Mr. Wittman will go first. He will have 2 minutes to ask a question of Mr. Mosher, who will then have 3 minutes to respond. At the conclusion of that 3 minutes, then Mr. Mosher can ask a question of Mr. Wittman. He'll have 2 minutes to ask the question. Mr. Wittman has 3 minutes to respond. We do not have rebuttals of these questions. These are the conditions agreed to by put forward by the Prince William Committee. And at the conclusion of this segment, then we would have the closing statements from the candidates.
Folks, one of the problems with Washington is gotcha politics. And gotcha politics is trying to put somebody on the spot and try to go ahead and make political points with a question. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to pass.
Within the past week or 10 days, Congressman, you voted in favor of a bill that will have dire effects for Chesapeake Bay. It was something with the order of stopping the overreach of the EPA on streams and rivers. We have a very difficult situation with Chesapeake Bay, a 6-state watershed, trying to get agreement that everyone does the same thing so that we can guarantee the life of the bay is very difficult. And I ask that you explain your vote, and perhaps I've got the bill wrong.
Glad to explain it. I'm going to explain 2 things. First of all is I have a bill in called the Chesapeake Bay Accountability and Recovery Act. By the way, that Senator Warner is carrying on the Senate side that we hope will pass and the President will sign into law. That is the perfect way for us to, in a bipartisan way, address issues with the Bay. The issue brought up concerning the definition of waters of the United States is an effort by the EPA to broaden that definition to require permitting in many instances where there is not a wetland. It is not the proper way to go about addressing the issue with the Chesapeake Bay. It gets away from the cooperative agreements that we have with state governments, with local governments, and involving them in policy. It also makes it much, much more difficult to really get to the root causes of what's called non-point source pollution, which is anything that doesn't come out of a pipe. I want to make sure that we are working constructively with local and state governments, doing 2 things, making sure we understand exactly where every penny of money that's allocated for bay restoration goes. My bill does that with what's called cross-cut budgeting, making sure that transparency is there. And secondly is making sure that there's accountability. Anybody that runs a business says if we're going to spend money, let's make sure it's producing results. Right now, there's no effort to do that on bay programs, either at the federal level or at the state level. Let's make sure that we evaluate every penny that's going into bay restoration, including things like water quality improvements, including things like oyster bed restoration. Let's determine what works, and let's continue to fund that. Let's determine what doesn't work, and let's not fund that. Let's get money to where we can show that it produces results. There's some great success stories out there. Look at what's happening to the oyster in the Chesapeake Bay. The oyster harvest now in Virginia, last year, over 500,000 bushels. Talk about helping to clean up the bay. Let's encourage more oyster production. Filter feeders, that's the way to go about this, not more federal government regulation. Let's encourage that entrepreneurial spirit. You want to talk about small business growth, look at the growth of aquaculture operations in Eastern Virginia. Look at the folks that on their docks are growing oysters that are having these small businesses. Those oysters are filter feeders. They do more to clean up the bay than any government overregulation that happens through EPA. Let's encourage that. Let's encourage those filters, Mother Nature's filters, to help us do the job. To me, that's the way we fix the bay, not more government regulation, not more saying, well, you got to get a permit for this, and if a drop of water falls here, let's make sure you get a permit for that. The most powerful way for us to fix the problem is to make sure there's accountability, transparency, understanding where the dollars go, and making sure that it produces results. That's done everywhere else every day. Let's focus on that rather than more federal government oversight, regulation, and intersecting with state and local programs that are working like oyster aquaculture.
Well, you could stay there, Mr. Wittman, because you now have the closing statement. 2 minutes.
Well, folks, I want to thank you again. A great opportunity this evening to join you, to have this discussion about issues. This is what makes our country great, the ability for us to do that, to make sure that we provide information so that you, come November 4th, can make that decision about who should represent you in Washington. I'm asking for your vote. In the years that I've been there, try to make sure that I'm connected with folks back home, understanding that the great ideas that have moved this nation forward don't come from inside the Beltway. They come from right here. And I want to make sure that I'm continuing to take your ideas to make sure that your government works for you. You are the owners of this government. Let's never forget that. And your elected officials should never forget that. What I've tried to do is to make sure that as I travel through the district is to make sure that I visit here in Prince William County in places like the Chamber of Commerce. I go and meet with veterans. We've had some great Veterans Council meetings, doing things like having a tick and Lyme disease forum to make sure we understand what are some of the public health issues here. Taking your ideas back to Washington, putting them in place, finding those areas that we agree upon is the way to get our government going. I can tell you, my effort there in Washington is to make sure I know every other member so that I find out what we have in common. Give you a great example. Chris Van Hollen and I, we probably disagree on some things. Chris Van Hollen and I formed the Chesapeake Bay Caucus because we know that's best for our region, it's best for our nation. Joe Courtney, member from Connecticut, he and I know that working together on shipbuilding, we had a shipbuilding caucus today. Joe Courtney and I know that working together, we will meet the nation's interest by making sure that we are getting things done to build our Navy back to where it needs to be. Mr. Connolly and I know that public service is an important part of what happens in this nation. He and I work together. We formed the Public Service Caucus to get things done. I'm asking you to send me back to Washington to make sure I can continue that bipartisan effort of getting things done in your interest, in the interest of the nation. Thank you.
Seven years ago, Representative Wittman appointed me to his Environmental Advisory Committee, and I've been hearing about that cross-cutting budget business for 7 years. The speech has gotten better, but where are the results? At the end of my opening remarks, I asked if you were happy with the performance of Congress. If in the privacy of your own mind you thought, no, I'm not happy, then don't you think things would get better if there were more good jobs with good wages being spent to increase the demand for goods and services so the economy would grow and the tax base would be broadened? Remember, our national debt would be decreased relative to the growth of the economy. Wouldn't you be happier if you knew we could increase jobs and grow the economy by cleaning up the environment and getting off fossil fuels? We can do these things, but when the President sent the American Jobs Act to the Congress, the Senate filibustered it. It contained a provision for an infrastructure development bank which would leverage taxpayer money against private investment and sovereign fund investment so that we could get on with the repairs and renewal of our crumbling infrastructure, including those projects that are required to adapt to the fact of rising sea levels, because, as I said before, my friends, climate change is real, climate change is here. In the House of Representatives, Rosa DeLauro offered a bill co-sponsored only by Democrats to create an infrastructure bank. It is dying in committee. Congressman Jim McDermott has offered a carbon pricing bill, which is revenue neutral, and it's a carbon fee and dividend method for reducing our CO2 emissions. The bill creates jobs, grows the economy, and increases the income of all Americans. It cuts our CO2 emissions in half in 20 years. Congressman Chris Van Hollen is offering a bill shifting gains in productivity to be more equally shared between management and workers. In the 25-year period after the end of World War II, our productivity increased 97%. The median wage increased 95%. It was a shared growth in our economy. In the last 3 decades, productivity has increased 5%, but the median wage has only increased 5%. Did I say 75% increase in median wage? 5% increase. That is, and CEO pay has risen 937%. My opponent, the incumbent, is not to be found in the sponsorship of any of these bills. His record is as footprints in the sand. In 2014 alone, he had 1 pro-environment vote and 27 anti-environment votes. When in Congress, I will be a pro-environment voter. Thank you.
I'm fortunate to have been able to hear debates like this in Virginia now for more than a dozen years. And what consistently strikes me about candidates and challengers or incumbents is the extent to which they treat the voters of this Commonwealth with respect. They do not dodge questions. They disagree without being too disagreeable. And I think that the lessons that we learn here in Virginia are lessons that it's a shame the other states don't follow our lead on this civility in politics. And so I want to thank you for coming. You were on your best behavior, too. I want to thank the candidates. I think we were able to learn a great deal tonight about what shape the country would take with these candidates if they become elected. Thank you all.